Hello, everybody. We will start in a few minutes. We are just waiting for Mrs. Ramos, so please be patient with us. Thank you. Tim, I would suggest that you maybe start by introducing the panel. And once that Gabriela is here, you can just introduce her. But let me just start by saying good morning and good afternoon to all of you from UNESCO Paris. We are very happy to welcome you to this fourth edition of UNESCO's series of regional expert consultations against gender stereotypes, with the aim to change mindsets and norms. And as you know, today we're focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me also remind you that English and Spanish interpretation is available, and you can click on the globe on your screen. And as soon as Gabriela Ramos, our Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences, is here, she will take the floor. But in the meanwhile, let me just ask our moderator, Tim Shand. He is the co-founder and director of Shand Clark Consulting, and he's also an expert on gender, masculinities, and harmful stereotype. I will just ask him to introduce the panel, and as soon as Mrs. Ramos is here, you can give her the floor. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna Maria, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. We've got over 50 people participating online, and a huge thanks to the fantastic panel that we've got that we're going to introduce in a moment. As Anna Maria said, we want to explore the issue of gender stereotypes. I think we know more and more that laws and policies have significantly progressed around gender equality, around women's rights, around human rights, but we continue to face challenges around negative mindsets, around stereotypes, around what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, and the reproduction and reinforcement of those. And that's really what we want to dive down into today. So let me just say a couple of words about the UNESCO flagship program that this is part of, before I introduce the great panelists that we have with us. So UNESCO is on a journey, as Anna Maria said. This is the fourth regional consultation, and it's part of a broader flagship program that UNESCO is launching, which sits within its gender equality work, which really aims to think about and challenge and address gender stereotypes globally. These regional consultations will feed into a research report. UNESCO also intends to create a network of role models, particularly male role models, and also a global advocacy campaign. And we'd love to keep in contact with all of you who are online, and also, of course, our distinguished panel of speakers. In terms of the format, after I introduce the speakers, we'll have an interactive conversation together with them. And during that time, I see that people are already posting in the chat box, which is fantastic. And please keep engaging interactively with us. We'll also use the Q&A box to come to the panelists after I've had a conversation with them for about 30 minutes. So please also use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And then after that, we will then talk about recommendations for UNESCO's flagship program. The whole aim of this event is really to feed into what should UNESCO do. And we'll come back to all of you online to seek your input. And then we'll conclude. I'm delighted that we'll have closing remarks from Paulo Cavero from UNESCO's office in Kingston, who I'll introduce when we get there, and then I'll end the event. So yeah, just an emphasis that this is as participatory as possible. We really want to try and benefit from the technology and to engage you all. So please do. We've got a slightly smaller group than we've had previously, which is great. So we'll try and make this as engaging as possible. So let me turn to the great panel that we've got. So firstly, Ana Inés Alvarez is Executive Director of the Avon Foundation in Argentina and has over 18 years experience in the field of social work within the public and private sector. She leads Avon's Promise to Help End Violence Against Women and the Women's Solidarity Award, and her work has led Avon to become the first Argentinian company to provide paid leave for female employees. Diana Parra is Undersecretary for Women at the Mayor's Office in Bogota, Colombia, and she is representing Dr. Diana Rodriguez Franco, who is the Secretary for Women at the office. Thank you, Diana, for stepping in at the last moment. Professor Fabian Goyen Eche is Director of International Relations of the Municipality of Montevideo, in Uruguay. She is a qualified attorney and was formerly legal counsel in Uruguay's Ministry of Economy and Finance. She is an associate professor of criminal law and criminology at the University of the Republic in Uruguay. Judith Wedderburn is previous director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for Jamaica and the Eastern Caribbean. She has been an advocate, practitioner, and researcher on gender development, education, training, and learning across the Caribbean for over 30 years. She is currently the Jamaica country expert for the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. Kevin Liverpool is administrator of Carryman, the Caribbean Male Action Network, a regional network of individuals and organizations focused on engaging men and boys to promote gender equality and end violence against women. Kevin is a former secondary school teacher and has worked in civil society for over 20 years, supporting several NGOs. Dr. Miguel Fontes is executive director and chair of the board of Promundo Brazil. Miguel has experience in corporate social responsibility, sustainability strategies, strategic analysis of public and economic policy, social impact assessments, research evaluation, social mobilization, and HIV. His doctorate is in public health from Johns Hopkins University. So what a fantastic panel we have. And let me just pause for a moment to see whether Gabriela has now been able to join
here,
us.
Tim.
Fantastic. Welcome, Gabriela. The floor is yours.
And I'm very sorry, but I have the executive board, and as you know, we international organizations would really need our board to support the programs. So I was connected, but it's only because of this fantastic Latin American and the Caribbean consultation that I left them. I hope that I will not be missing any political decision, but I think that it was very important for me to be with you here, with Tim, with Ana Maria, and all of the friends in UNESCO that are advancing these consultations. And thank you, Ana Inés, Diana, Fabiana, Judith, Kevin, and Miguel. Qué gusto que nos acompañen, de verdad, es una maravilla.
Thank you to all of you. It's fantastic to have you here.
You know that in UNESCO, gender is a global priority. And there are many programs that we have advanced to make it count. But this consultation in particular is due to the renewed interest in trying to find the best way to counter all this stereotyping, all these biases, all the way we inform our thinking about men and women, and that we could advance an agenda that will really help us achieve the equality that we are not yet claiming to have. And therefore, what you bring to this table is going to be really precious for us. We want to hear from you on what works, how it works, how can we almost put it together to address the gender gaps that we see everywhere, but particularly on this important question of the way we conceive our societies and the role modelings that we developed, because we know that when women don't see what they can be, they just cannot even imagine it. And we saw it with the vice president of the US being the first woman, as there are many first women. And I would just quote what her mom told her, no, you're the first one, but be sure that you will not be the last one. And so it's the presence, is the role, is the impact, is how much more contributions women could make if we only had equality ensured. And this is not the case. This has never been the case, even in the countries that are more advanced in gender equality. And with COVID, all these vulnerabilities just provided us a mirror, un fantástico espejo, o no fantástico, un espantoso espejo, donde nos miramos, where we see ourselves. We see ourselves in the mirror and we don't like what we're seeing, because we know that due to the less leverage, less financial leverage, more vulnerability in terms of how to cope with these kind of shocks, the impact that the COVID is having on women is really very, very high. Not only because they are the ones really fighting the pandemic, with 90% of care workers or 70% of the health system workers. Also, in many countries, Latin America is particularly the case. They compose the majority of teachers, and they compose the majority of mothers that are at home trying to help their children advance their learning. But then, differently from the 2008 crisis, this pandemic has also hit very hard on those sectors where women are overrepresented, which is the entertainment, which is the services, which is the restoration, which is the tourism, culture, you name it. These are sectors where women are really overrepresented and they're just shut down. And therefore, the question here is, how do we ensure that the post-COVID world has a gender lens in defining the responses. The worst case, and you also know it because you are the experts, is the increase in violence against women. And unfortunately, Latin America stands out as one of the regions that are really more violent in the whole world. And this is really sad, because the reality is that violence was already present in our societies. The level of violence have always been there, domestic and intimate violence at home, cyberbullying and harassment online, but also the just aggression, rape, murder. We see so many women in the streets of our countries, and I am Mexican, and we see them standing for a situation that is not acceptable. Many leaders have named this the shadow pandemic. The international murder of women because of their gender kills 12 women daily in this region, which is home to 14 of the 25 countries with the highest rate of feminicide in the world, and where 98 of gender-related killings go unprosecuted, which even the numbers doesn't say anything because we don't really know. We assume, we do some extrapolations, but the reality is that we don't even know. The shameful case of Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua, in my country, las desaparecidas de Juárez, no? Where 1,000 women have been reported missing since 1993, and you have the mothers, you have that they will never let go, but the reality is that no justice has been made for these cases. And according to the former UN Special Rapporteur Rashida Manjoo, the goal of these killings is to have a symbolic effect, to destroy the victims' humanity, integrity, and identity. They were nothing. And I think this is something that we need to change. They were nothing. This is just a terrible message. And this is why we want to change these perceptions, and we want to change these outcomes that are so terrible for this big part of our societies. You know that the UN launched the Spotlight Initiative in Argentina, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico in 2018 with a budget of 50 billion. But last year, only in Mexico, the National Network of Shelters reported having received 80% more calls since the pandemic started, while the number of women and children admitted to 69 shelters has increased by 30%. Violence against women is also common in the Caribbean. The Dominican Republic has also confirmed that the increase in calls had been exponential. So, conclusion, yes, we need resources. Yes, we need institutions. Yes, we need shelters. Yes, we need legal frameworks that counter these outcomes. But also we need to change the social norms, culture, and the toxic masculinities that I can tell you is not only hurting women, but also men in the way they are educated and advanced in their lives. And I'm glad that we have Tim with us because he's an expert on this. So we will be humbled to learn from you. We will be gathering all this expertise that we are gaining from the regions. Is not only the bad numbers that we have, it's also that we have innovative policies, innovative ways of addressing these issues. We have this civil society that is so fantastic in Latin America that has really formed a barrier to advance justice and to advance equality. And therefore, without not noting the numbers and not noting the outcomes, we also want to have a positive message of the things that you are doing, of the analysis that you are carrying forward, and that could help us inform our initiative and build up a much more harmonious and respectful and careful way of dealing with each other. So I leave you with in the great hands of Tim, and we hope to keep in touch with you and to learn from you and to see how much we can advance a meaningful agenda to counter these outcomes, to reduce this impact, and to advance the agenda for equality. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to the outcomes of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Muchas gracias for those very inspiring remarks.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to begin with Ana Inés, and let me just remind all the speakers to please stick to 3 minutes in their responses, and we'll try to go through everybody and have a number of questions in a discussion. Ana, Gabriela just mentioned the sense of that women are worth nothing, and Ana, I know that you in your work, Ana Inés, have focused a lot on violence against women, and would be great for your perspective on the question of what are the main issues and stereotypes that we need to address within Latin America and the Caribbean.
Bueno, muy buenos días, muchísimas gracias por esta.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having invited me to be here. I want to say hi to everybody who's connected. I wanted to mention figures which are a reflection of existing stereotypes. There's a figure that really is in my mind since confinement started in March. There were 2,219 murders of women or transgender people. And why do I mention these murders of women as reflecting these stereotypes? Because it is the tip of the pyramid of cruelty of the societies we live in. And we need to work to change these stereotypes. And in doing so, we need to bear in mind these figures, which really showcase the asymmetries and the social roles that we all live within or have to deal with. They are not necessarily constant, but the figures are there. You can see how many people are actually getting killed, and it shows how urgent it is to address these matters. And there are stereotypes in Latin America having to do with how men are perceived and act in or just in public space and the roles they are allowed to have. So men are okay in the public space, in the public sphere. However, women are confined to the private space. However, that is not the case. We go out there, we go and keep our jobs, and in fact, we spend, according to some surveys, double the time working than men because we have to hold our jobs and we also have to do a lot of work elsewhere. And during COVID and confinement, this was even clearer because in some cases, even though everybody was allowed to work from home, in fact, remunerated work went down much more for women than for men. So that stereotype of who's working, who goes out there into the public or space and who stays at home actually prevailed even during confinement. And this has to do with an asymmetry of power between men and women that is of course, very stark and is also showcased in the figures of domestic violence. And which was exacerbated during confinement and during this pandemic. And I would also like to mention the transgender collective situation in Latin America, because the level of marginalization that they suffer has increased even more than before. Their starting point was already full of precariousness at home vis-a-vis their job. Many countries don't even recognize their actual identity. That was the starting point, and so that it was a very precarious starting point, and it became a very dire one, a much more urgent one. All of the indicators in Latin America across the region and in specific countries as well show us that breaking down these stereotypes is of the utmost urgency. And
Anna Maria, sorry, I'm just
we need
gonna...
to bear in mind the importance of our work.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thanks so much. Really appreciate
That's all.
it.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for taking up too much time.
No problem at all. That was great. Diana, could I move to you, please, for your perspective on this, given where you sit within the, as you know, within the office in Bogota, in the mayor's office. It would be great for your thoughts on what the key stereotypes and challenges are within Latin America.
I'm sorry, this is Judith. We are not hearing the
Gracias,
translation.
Tim. Lo primero hay que decir que siempre cuando se habla de género
The first thing, I should say that every time we talk about gender, we have to see it as part of an overall continuum of violence. And we can see that violence also manifests itself, latent violence also channels into these stereotypes and these different traditional roles. And that's what we see in relations between men and women. In Bogota, what we've seen is that we've seen two developments. First of all, a significant increase in the number of women who've suffered because of the pandemic. And we see women who are being really hemmed in. The schools are closed, so the children are at home all day. And what this means is that the women have to be dealing with that every day. They're not only mothers, but they're also teachers, they're friends, everything else. Their whole daily life is now borne on their shoulders at home. And then when it comes to gender violence in Bogota, we've seen an increase in the number of complaints of violence against women that has skyrocketed. And there are also many other women who simply weren't able to go and file a complaint. They were victims of domestic violence, but they weren't able to leave their houses because of the lockdown. So the figures that have reported cases are certainly lower than what actually happened. This is the trend we see. Now we have a line, which is our purple line, which is the number of people who call in on hotline. And we also have in our Women's Affairs office do this. And we went from 30% of our calls going up to 80% of the calls had to do with domestic violence. We also have a huge increase in the number of requests for assistance and support from women. 240% increase in the number of other requests for other services, shelter, etc. So the entire women are overburdened. The women's support network is overburdened. And when we look at the system of healthcare in Colombia, it's really something quite novel in Latin America, where it's something that's more of a grassroots and from the federal level up to the central level more. And what this means is that we're more flexible in making sure that we can come up with tailored solutions to cope with this huge increase in social needs that has been brought on by the pandemic and the aggravation and reproduction of these deeply entrenched gender stereotypes. And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to turn around. And that's the process that we're deeply involved in.
Diana, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Let me just interrupt for a moment and ask Judith. I know that she's had some problems with accessing the translation. Judith, have you been able to find the globe at the bottom of the screen? Just flagging that there's a globe there where you can access English. Fabiana, let me turn to you next, and you also come with a local government perspective. I think what I would like to ask you and be interested, given your background, particularly your legal background, as I understand, is you know, as Gabriela Ramos said at the beginning, we do have good laws and policies, but why is it that despite the fact that we have good, could be much better, but nevertheless we have legal policies in place, do we still face challenges, as Diana Parra has just mentioned, around violence against women, around gender stereotypes? What are the key issues that continue to face, create barriers for us? Fabiana.
Bueno, muy buenos días para todos.
Hello, everyone. One and all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I'm very interested in that question. Actually, it's a good one. This is one of the issues that we've been contending with over the past year when we've been contending with the pandemic, not just in Montevideo, but around the country. What we've seen is an increase in the workload for women, and this also has to do with childcare, with reproductive rights. We also see an increase in gender violence. So what I could add to this is that in Montevideo, what we see is that we have an advantage because nationwide we have good laws, which gives us an integrated healthcare system that was created and it's universal across the country. And it was designed to deal with situations like this and to help us try to compensate for these deeply entrenched stereotypes where women are supposed to do it all, right? And when it comes to health problems during the pandemic, things have gotten worse. And also when it comes to fighting against gender violence, we've set up a program a couple of years ago. We have a new law that also deals with civil cases, criminal cases, and we now have municipal courts that have been set up to deal with specific cases of domestic violence, etc. But we're not completely equipped to deal with what we've seen, because once the pandemic really hit us, both systems, our national integrated health system and also our nationwide system for fighting against gender violence were flattened. We suffered from a lack of funds. We were not able to roll the programs out throughout the entire country, but also in our country, the pandemic came with a government that had just adopted a new budget. And right now, we still don't know whether or not the law against gender violence is going to be financed fully so that it could be implemented fully. So like somebody else said, it's one thing to have laws in the books, but you also need action and in particular money. You need a budget. Another thing I can add is that, and this is certainly not one of the least important issues, the pandemic has had an impact on healthcare, of course, and on gender violence. But there's another thing that's become a big concern of ours, and that is what's going on with the children, because schools are closed, preschools are closed, and children who are stuck at home with somebody who is a predator, somebody who's abusing them sexually or physically or psychologically, they have no place to run away to. And the school might be the only place where they can actually develop relationships of trust with older people and other children. And and so many children, even if they're not in that situation, they're missing out on opportunities to engage in culture, to engage in sports, to engage in so many other things. So the pandemic has also made poverty much worse, and it's made it very difficult for more and more people to meet their basic needs. And that's the general context. So the pandemic isn't something that's just brought with us a specific health concern related to the coronavirus. It is something that has been something that's been like acted as an accelerator for things like the rise of more gender violence, more women who are just suffering from too much of a workload, et cetera, and this is due to these stereotypes.
Great, thank you very much, Fabiana. That was really helpful. Judith, could I come to you next? And one of the things that Fabiana just mentioned is the issue of poverty. And I know that you've done a lot of work on globalization, liberalization. Would be great to have your perspective on what the key challenges and stereotypes that we need to address in Latin America and the Caribbean are, and if you felt able to bring in this question of kind of market forces and globalization would be really useful as well. Thank you.
Okay, I will try in my 4 minutes. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I am really pleased and honored to be on this panel. Your question takes me directly to how COVID-19 has impacted our different communities. Now, speaking specifically about Jamaica, I'm aware that similar conditions exist in other Caribbean islands, but what was clearly exposed here is how deeply entrenched social norms and gender stereotypical roles and responsibilities affect women in particular and men differently, and aggravated their situations of deeply entrenched poverty. It has a very distinct gender component because in the initial lockdown periods, it was clear that the stay-at-home requirements, which involved extra care work for women who are already household heads, who have lost jobs, can't go out to work, maybe under curfew regulations. They're in charge of online school homework. Their inability to earn certainly aggravated their poverty situation. The data tells us that 47% of our households, single-headed households, are women, single women. So the reports that are coming out now is how deeply that situation of poverty is shaped by the gender norms and expectations that persist. In respect of market forces and globalization, we had a particular experience with call centers. They call themselves business sourcing operations. Our largest site of early COVID infections was in one such center. And the population of their employees was 70% women, single women. And once they followed, the government had to lock them down. They were at first unwilling to do so. Thankfully, the government acted. And there was great discomfort in that community, that business community, that the global practices were at risk and that Jamaica stood the possibility of losing this opportunity to create jobs. And so that my language of duplicity on the part of such globally driven organizations was exposed. Those employees were primarily young women. And of course, those business sourcing organizations are responding to the global demands for their own product, profitability. And it was very clear to me that that has not changed. Where they can operate with fewer restrictions and fewer limitations for maximum profit, they will. Thankfully, there were several discussions, quiet discussions with the government, and eventually the whole concept of at-home online working became a larger part of our reality, which of course has its own challenges because the workers still are not accessing their labor rights and all those kinds of things. But that's my initial comment at this time.
Thank you very much, Judith. Let me just remind everyone participating to please post their questions either in the chat box or the Q&A. We've had one person so far sending a question. Thank you for that. And we'll come to questions shortly. Let me turn to Kevin. Kevin, one of the things that Gabriela Ramos mentioned was the need to work with men to shift masculinities. It's kind of been mentioned a couple of times in this conversation so far. From Kariman's perspective, what's the issue? What's the challenge that necessitates us to work with men and boys?
Thank you very much. So in the context of this consultation, the main issues I would say are the high rates of gender-based violence across the Caribbean, which has been put forward in several studies, including studies by the IDB, by UNFPA, by UN Women, which show that within several Caribbean territories, 1 in 3 women report being victims of intimate partner violence within 12 months of that study. Additionally, there are high rates of child sexual abuse and violence across the Caribbean, and male-on-male violence. And for Caribbean, the real issues are that men make up the majority of perpetrators in all these areas. In terms of the stereotypes, we see across the Caribbean that there is still that holding on to very traditional gender roles. And all of this is because we're still very entrenched in patriarchal values. So stereotypes such as men being the breadwinners, while women are homemakers and responsible for taking care of children. Stereotypes such as men having the final say in the home, and men having to suppress their emotions, and any sign of vulnerability is seen as being less than a man or being a weak man. We see as all contributing to these issues within the Caribbean setting. Additionally, we see a growing normalization of infidelity within intimate relationships. There's a very popular song in Trinidad right now where, and it's very popular, interestingly, among men and women, where the songwriter is saying, I am going to commit an affair first before you commit an affair. You know, and it's very popular, and people sing it and people like it. But we have that growing normalization of infidelity within intimate relationships. But because of all these different stereotypes that condition men to always have to be strong and always have to be in control, there is a difficulty when it comes to dealing with these intimate challenges within intimate relationships. And also given the advancement of women in terms of education, the economic empowerment of women that we're experiencing in the Caribbean, we find that men are compensating by using violence. I will pause there for now.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. Let me turn finally in this round of conversation to Miguel. Miguel, I mean, you also come from, from Promundo's perspective, a strong focus on the importance of engaging men and working on masculinities. I also know, from your bio that you've worked a lot in the private sector. So it'd be great if you have any particular reflections on both building on what Kevin has said in terms of the need to work with men and those challenges, and anything around the kind of the role of the private sector and how we understand the key challenges of gender stereotypes in Brazil and more broadly in the region.
Thank you, Tim. Talking about stereotypes, I think it's very important the context of the discussion with UNESCO is to understand that behind the stereotypes, there is, especially in Latin America, the culture of machismo. That's the word, that's the word that we need to deal with. And that goes into extremes in a situation like COVID. I say this because I think that the case of gender-based violence is really a question of the culture of machismo. It's not so much about a question of toxic masculinity, that we would deal much more with a biological issue. What we're dealing here is with a cultural, very rigid norms on gender. And that has an effect extreme on COVID, not only for women on gender-based violence, but for men themselves. They are dying in much larger numbers in Brazil due to COVID than women. And why is that? Because of chronic diseases, of several conditions that men create for themselves because of the machista culture that we have. And gets to the point that in Brazil, we have a number of boys more than girls up to the age of 18. By the age of 20 on, we have today in Brazil 4.3 million women more than men. And why is that? That is because of the stereotypes of masculinities that we have, that men should put themselves at risk, that men, should not take care of their health. What we need to understand is and promote is that gender equality is great for men. It's wonderful of you being able to show your emotions for your health. It's great to participate on early child development because of family considerations and domestic affairs, because you socialize more, you participate more in the family dynamics. And this is crucial understanding. And the private sector has a key role in that, not only the public sector and the social sector, because in the private environment, we understand also the machista role, culture, playing a key role in making these differences into the extremes. So by doing educational efforts, formative efforts to really make men think, how these conditions really create problems for themselves, self-inflicted issues, it's quite important. And I think COVID, it brings exactly that kind of situation. You go to homes, you look at the families, and this patriarchal structure that is created. If men has to come back at home, they don't have the tools, they don't have the skills, they don't have a formation, as Paulo Freire would say, exchange of experiences of other men to really think on a different way that will really provide them the opportunity to reduce gender-based equality, gender-based violence, but also for them to look for themselves and for their own health's sake. So I think this is the stereotype issues.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. What a great initial set of comments, and clearly a whole set of things that we really need to kind of dig into more deeply. Can I move us on to a conversation around solutions within the region? And one of the comments, the questions that we've had already is kind of what are NGOs doing, what are civil society doing? So anybody that would like to talk more from the panel around examples that they're aware of, what gives them hope in these darker times of COVID? What is happening on the ground, policies, activism, the role of the private sector that you think is a good solution that you would like to flag to address these challenges around gender stereotypes? Anybody like to contribute? Judith?
Can I say an example, Tim?
Yeah, sorry, Judith. I think Judith jumped in first, and then I'll bring you in, Miko.
Go ahead. I'll go after him, please.
No, go ahead, Judith. Your mic's on, and Miguel is muted himself. Please go ahead.
Well, my initial comment when I saw this question was to say, in our case, I don't know what Kevin thinks, maybe it's too early to be predicting what solutions should be, precisely because some of the stereotypical behavior and unconscious bias that exists, that we experience, are so deeply rooted. However, how do I put it? One positive, and Kevin did refer to it, and the work of Kariman, is to bring men more intentionally into this discussion about gender roles, stereotypical behavior, and what is called in some areas a toxic masculinity. Because I think we have to find a way to demonstrate, as Manuel just said, how both women and men and their children benefit from making these shifts in behaviors, speaking frankly about their unconscious bias and how those manifest themselves in discrimination. I see signs of that happening, and I would like to think that we will continue to do that, because I honestly feel that this horrendous rate of violence against women is not going to be sufficiently reduced as it needs to be. It's an urgent matter without getting our men and boys into this discussion at an early age. We have some research, and don't know if Kevin must be familiar with it, that has been taking place quietly for years, but is very relevant now. Done by medical doctors, sociologists, psychotherapists, that demonstrate how many of our young men who are now violence perpetrators will have been violated in their youth, will have suffered violence in the home from one parent or the other, or one adult family member or the other, or in their community. So they grow up experiencing, understanding that the way to solve a problem, the way to retain my power and control is to be violent. I think that's a very deep problem that needs to be addressed. If I can make one other comment in respect of what governments can do, one experience here from the Jamaican government is in the early COVID times, when they realized the impact of lockdown. Families, heads of families could not access remittances. So the government identified funds, but getting those remittances to over 300,000 people was a challenge. The systems did not exist. The remittance agencies were overwhelmed. The banks wouldn't accept new bank accounts. So that remains a challenge. They're working on it. But in order for the government to be proactive in addressing the urgent needs of poor families by contributing welfare benefits of whatever kind, is clearly going to continue to be a part of a solution going forward. And for that, we need the digital and internet access, which we don't always have, so it becomes a problem.
Great, thank you very much, Judith. Miguel, if I turn to you next, one of the things that Judith just said is we need to be more intentional about working with men. And my question to you would be, how do we do that, and what is happening on that already that we should be mindful of?
Thank you. The collaboration with the government is crucial and to really enforce public policy. So Promundo has a methodology called Program P, engaging men in fatherhood, in early child development. And these groups of men to really exchange their experiences, their understanding about masculinity, to engage more as caregivers in early child development. And what was interesting, we are working with home visitors, a national home visitors program in Brazil. And COVID brought us an opportunity. It's a horrible pandemic, but it brought us an opportunity. We were able to create what we call the Program P online. We were able to create groups of men using WhatsApp. And what is fantastic has been is that it's the same methodology, a lot of sessions, but they can respond anytime they want because we are using more online. And the same way we are doing here, that I'm inviting you to my home. By using the social technology, we have been being able to go to their homes, of men, and get them also to produce material on how they are playing with the kids. What are the testimonials of their partners? What are the ways they are finding? So based on this very rich experience, it's not a vertical education of how to be a father, but it's really a participatory approach on the importance of getting engaged, of reducing discussions at home with the partner, of violence at home, to get them to produce new ways of playing, of finding food baskets, trying to get information on a very formative approach, just recognized by Paulo Freire, for example, in Brazil, on the every experience of men and families can build in to a possibility of change, of really defeating the machismo culture that creates so many harms to the families in Brazil. And we are finding, so we have been able to during COVID, to have groups of men of over 100 men participated. And the amount of material that we have today of testimonials, of options of how to get engaged at home, of the benefits, of the impact of such methodology, it's really great. I'm really eager and I'm really positive about the potential of change by engaging men in a big way.
Great, thank you very much. Ana Inez, Diana, Fabiana, would either of you like to come in on the question of solutions? Kevin, would you like to?
Hola, sí,
Hola.
podemos compartir la experiencia que estamos teniendo en Montevideo.
Hello. We can talk about our experience in Montevideo. The current administration, who has a new minister for internet affairs, has created a basic support to citizens program in the context of the pandemic. Internet public policy is intersectorial in Montevideo and also has a gender perspective. In everything we have, there's always a dimension taken into account, participation of women, of men as well, the situation of youth in that program, and this is not only in the development of the policies, but also in their implementation. Assistance services to women who have suffered violence have increased during COVID. There are specific places that give legal and psychological support to women, a victim of or who have suffered violence, and new spaces are being created so that women can go to these places to seek this type of support when they have suffered violence. There are also different clinics that are offering healthcare support for women, and these clinics have extended their opening hours, taking into account that the pandemic has really encroached upon how much time women have available for anything else beyond work and working at home. And of course, nobody pays anybody to for all of the work you do at home. So that's also been helpful to extend the opening hours of these clinics. As we know, poverty has deepened very much recently in Latin America with the pandemic, and it has been worse for women throughout the region and in Montevideo as well. And so there are some other programs trying to address this specifically. These are our programs, but we are also participating in other programs that are not exclusively ours. We are also helping in a hotline that's been created for people who have mental health problems or depression or similar disorders that have been exacerbated due to the pandemic. Also, assistance to the elderly. We are specifically worried about older women who have sometimes there are several circumstances that make their situation particularly vulnerable. And so we have also tried to improve our assistance to them. We have closed some services because of confinement, but we are trying to redesign them to be able to assist, for example, older people who live on the street so that they can receive assistance during the day and psychological support as well that they need even more given the current circumstances. These are measures we have taken in the context of the pandemic. Furthermore, what we are doing is usually part of different gender equality broader programs or initiatives in which, of course, we participate. Previous speakers have mentioned different forms of masculinity. Well, we have a program regarding that. We, of course, have a specific gender equality program. And we do consider that it's very important to, of course, keep talking about these issues all of the time, because in spite of all of the initiatives that are being undertaken, there is still much to be done. And the beneficiaries are not women, it is all of society. I would also like to mention regarding visibility that we try to give visibility to women who are spearheading these types of initiatives. Fortunately, right now we have a government with a lot of female presence, and the majority of the voices that are being heard in mass media, including official media, are men. In fact, we usually just hear the voices of men talking on behalf of the government or explaining public policy. And scientists that have more visibility, for example, vis-a-vis society, are usually just men, which is very worrying for us. And it is very important to give visibility to women in the public sphere, particularly when we are talking about new ways of addressing the needs of the citizens of our country, or when we are talking about finding alternatives, thinking outside the box. Women are very good at that, so they need to be part of the conversation. And it needs to be very clear to everybody. We need to show very clearly that women have something to contribute here, and we need to be heard. Thank you.
I'm just going to bring Anna Ines in a second, but just before I do, one of the questions that just relates to what has just been discussed, one of the questions from participants was precisely the issue around, do we need to have quotas for women's better participation in public life? One of the problems we've seen with COVID has been women insufficiently represented, and you've just mentioned the broader challenge. So I'd be grateful for panelists, and Fabiana, you may want to comment on that specifically given what you've said. But so I'll come back to you in a minute. But Judith, I'm going to go first to Anna Ines, who would like to speak, and then I'll come to you next. Anna
sure,
Ines.
thank you.
Sí, cómo no. Nuestro país ya hace un buen tiempo tiene acciones afirmativas relativas
Sorry, Fabiana. Anna Ines wanted to come in, sorry, and I'll come back to you. Apologies.
Gracias, Tim. Tal vez antes de irnos de la pregunta.
Thank you, Tim. That previous question mentioned what can be done during these pandemic times. Well, I would like to talk about things that have happened in the territories where we are present during the pandemic and confinement. When we talk about legal frameworks, it's important that to have appropriate legal frameworks. We have a sex education law in Argentina from 2006, which is a law that guarantees that throughout the learning experience of children, the construction of gender is something that is taught or addressed. And how to do that during the pandemic with so many asymmetries and hurdles in terms of access, internet access, for example. They are a big obstacle in this sense, and we need to see how we are going to address this. 80% of child sexual abuse cases the interpreters apologize, but the sound is not of a great quality. We are doing our best. something that we realized was very important was to have projects coming from children and from young people because sometimes it's very difficult for teachers to engage with children, and how we engage with these children since they are very young is important. It needs to be on the agenda. We need to see what countries have similar regulatory or legal frameworks such as this law in Argentina. And these initiatives have to be intersectorial because in terms of prevention and cultural change, we are doing a huge effort. So I wanted to mention that. Something else I would like to mention is the creation of a hotline in the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina, specifically dedicated to men. And most calls received on that hotline did not come from men themselves, but from the people around those men who, or the men involved in each case, who were looking for tools on how to address those situations. So we need to foster all of these conversations. And then regarding communication, outreach initiatives, we spend a lot of time in front of screens, and we need to make sure that everything we do in terms of communication, and this is something I would like to mention because I've worked on several communication strategies. One of them was called the caregivers, which was centered around the role of men at home during confinement and the pandemic. What I think, going back to my previous idea, is that in our communication strategy, we need to try and foster these conversations happening and continuing in households, because we're trying to change how people interact in general, and that is in their household as well. We need to make sure that our communication brings all of these initiatives and tools into the home. And this is about talking to the specific people involved and also their surrounding context as well. We need to engage in new ways, in different ways, and make sure that we engage with everybody, every single person, with every tool we have available to seek help, to talk about these things, and to foster all of these changes that are coming. Thank you. I wanted to mention this law in Argentina, this hotline, specifically male hotline, and also taking into account that campaigns have to have social responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I want to now move us on, and I'm going to come, Dan, I know you've had your hand up, so I will come to you next, but I just want to be mindful of the fact that participants have asked quite a few questions. So I'm going to pose a couple of those questions, and it would be great, Diana, and then I'll come to Judith after that, and then I'll come back to you, Fabiana, just to raise a couple of the things that people have been saying. So I think what I find interesting is that we've had a conversation about the need to shift machismo and to address patriarchy, and a couple of questions have said, well, what about the accountability mechanisms? You know, why are men able to perpetrate violence? Is the issue that they're not being held to account enough? Why are men not involved sufficiently in the childcare and the lives of the children? Is it because the systems are not sufficiently holding men to account, that we need stronger laws and policies? I'd really appreciate thoughts from the panelists on the balance, because it is true that in some countries we clearly have those. They're maybe not implemented enough, but I guess, is the challenge men need to be held to more to account, or is it the culture that is at stake? I think a second question about kind of how do we shift the next generation, and what's particularly the role of media? How do we engage media? Is media a positive or a negative force? And I'd be grateful for any thoughts that people had about the role models and any kind of beneficial role that role models and male role models in particular can play. And then I think this question of leadership that Fabiana, I mentioned in relation to what you said around how do we increase representation of women also came up there. So let me turn to you first, Diane, and then I'll bring in some other questions. And any thoughts you have on those, and anything else you wanted to say?
Okay, gracias, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. What I see is that when we're working on cultural roles, we have to look on both sides, not just with women. We have to continue working with women, offering them institutional support in order to attend to their needs as women and as victims of gender violence. But we also have to get the men involved, and the men have to question themselves and question these roles. And try to understand and get the men to understand why is it if they are aggressive, if they have aggressive behavior, they don't feel guilty. So my proposal is that we have to think about working in a way that makes violence no longer seem natural. And man often doesn't feel that it's anything unnatural about acting violent towards a woman. They're doing something that is natural. The woman is provoking me, and so it's basically something that they shoulder no blame for. So the idea is to take this behavior and make people realize that it isn't natural. Violence is an unnatural response. And so if we can teach our boys and girls that violence is something that is used when somebody does something that is very, very serious and breaks the law. But in other circumstances, the violence is definitely inappropriate. And if violence is used in any other way, it's just violence. And we have to address that and why it seems like a natural thing if it's violence of men against women. And another thing we have to address is men's relationship with their own emotions. Men, and in particular Latin American men, are very frustrated in their feelings. And it's because they aren't allowed to express their feelings freely. They aren't able to express their feelings to others. And the boomerang effect of this is that, men never cry. They're like a rock. They never, hearts of stone. And so we have to try to stop repressing the men so that they can learn how to express their feelings, so that they can understand how to express their feelings in ways that aren't violent. What we see in many countries and many cities are trying out new things. The idea is to take a break, set the pause button when things are starting to get out of hand, to sort of realize, oh yeah, this isn't natural, and try to find ways of getting men to stop and calmly try to understand their feelings. And we have this initiative that's called Women Who Are Calming. But they find a way of talking to men when the situation gets hot that makes it possible for the men to cool down, take a break. And so we've had hotlines for women for a long time, and in the Women's Affairs Department here at the City Council, the city government, we've decided to come up with a hotline for men, because it's very important. But it's also very important for women to have a much stronger presence in the decision-making process in government, because basically it's a department for women's affairs. And it's something that's a secondary matter, a secondary set of affairs, exactly, when men are the ones who are basically running government policy, et cetera. And we have to go there with our hat in hand, asking for support. This is something that's starting to change, because more and more women are taking a frontline role. So that's my invitation. We should really try to make sure that violence is a form of punishment. And if somebody's a victim of violence, but they haven't done anything wrong, then it's just a different type of violence that we have to denaturalize, make it possible for people to see that this is not natural. So I think that is something that informs our approach.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Judith, can I bring you in? We're coming towards time, and we do want to move on to recommendations, and we just a reminder also that we'll have some closing remarks from UNESCO. So just ask contributors to try and keep their remarks as short as possible. Judith. Judith, if you're trying to speak, you're on mute. Fabiana, could I move to you? Oh, go ahead.
I'm here.
Great, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm just saying that first I make a brief comment on quotas to say that it is definitely desirable in most situations because the research is very clear. You need a percentage of at least 30% anywhere for a group of women leaders to make a difference. However, my further challenge to women political leaders is to say, once you've gotten into power, what difference do you make? There's no point having women as leaders, either in the Senate or in a parliament, and they're not willing enough to be courageous enough to learn and understand the gender challenges that face women and men, and courageous enough to do the internal work in their own parties, to change this system in their parties, to build consciousness and understanding of these issues. Otherwise, they have no credibility to go outside of the party and to begin to tell other groups, civil society groups, etc., about achieving gender equality. I firmly believe that their credibility as women leaders depends on this. We have a situation in Jamaica where in the recent elections, we ended up with 29% women in parliament, which is historical and wonderful. But now we're waiting to see if they are going to make a difference along the lines I just mentioned. The other comment I wanted to make had to do with a recommendation. May I give my brief recommendation to UNESCO?
Great, please go ahead.
Okay, I really am encouraging UNESCO to take advantage of research where it exists to demonstrate how violence against children, boys and girls, affects how they become as men. It affects them in that they grow up understanding that that is the way to be a man. And they're vulnerable to the gangs in their communities that are just looking for young boys to shape into the next generation of criminals. So to me, it is a way of breaking that intergenerational cycle across generations. And that, of course, is related to intergenerational poverty, which certainly in Jamaica, sometimes a community or a family has that situation across 3 generations living together. On the other side, as it relates to women, we have research that can guide girls and parents and institutions to understand that children who grow up seeing violence against others, violence against their mother, perpetuated by a male partner or a husband or a brother, is the way to go. That they accept it, it's the norms. So we have to break that cycle as well. And I believe UNESCO would be well placed to lead the use of research findings which can demonstrate how damaging that situation is to both girls and boys, and therefore shapes the kind of women and men that they become.
Great, thank you very much, Judith. Fabiana, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask you to be very quick, but if you could also give your recommendation for UNESCO, and then I'll go to the remaining panelists. What should UNESCO take forward in your view on this initiative?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Tim. Well, I'll just go back to what we were saying at the outset. We have laws on quotas of women in parliament, et cetera, but that's not enough. The spirit of the most recent proposal has to do with a cultural change. So my first recommendation for UNESCO would be this: try to foster anything that enhances the visibility of women in all sectors of life, and the diversity of women as well, the diversity of women. You know, not always somebody who's a successful, white, middle-class woman with a higher education. She's the only image of, and the perfect homemaker, the super mom, the soccer mom, all that stuff. There's so many other ways to be successful as a woman in life. And we see this in Latin America. And in fact, when we were looking at the document, one of the things that we found of great interest is intersectionality. You know, equality between men and women is just part of a bigger picture of different crossroads of where we need equality, right? Where we need to enhance equality in the educational system. For example, it would be very useful if UNESCO were to try to push for the concept of gender equality being somehow ideological. And let me just mention an example of this in the context of my own national laws. It doesn't mean that we have to fly in the face of, you know, secular schools or things like that. There is a rising tide of people trying to cast gender equality as something that's ideological, something that's trying to hinder freedom and trying to fight against religious precepts, etc. I think organizations like UNESCO that is intergovernmental, I think the signals it sends out in this area are very, very important. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Fabiana. Miguel, can I come to you? We're going to have to be very short. Sorry, we're coming to the end of our discussion. Your top recommendation for UNESCO based on what you've heard so far?
13, just two quick remarks. The first one, in the UNESCO context, understanding that the cause of these gender stereotypes are related to education and cultural norms. Health is the consequence. So it's very important to get back to the basics of understanding the machista culture. By using terms like toxic masculinity, it means that men are toxic or that it's biological. It's not. That's the consequence. It's very important to get back to the basics of understanding the educational, cultural nature of the problem. And secondly, to really advocate for the 4 Ps: policy, program, pesquisa, as we would say in Portuguese, that means research, and promotion, social mobilizations, social communications, as Ana Inês, Gianna, and Fabiana also stated, and Judith, and all the other panelists. So these are the two remarks and suggestions I would give to UNESCO.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Kevin, can I bring you in for your recommendation to UNESCO based on what you've heard?
Oh, thanks. So definitely, I would like to recommend to UNESCO that their initiatives and programs must be culturally relevant. Even though we are trying to change culture and some social norms, whatever programs we bring in must be rooted within cultural experience, and we must appreciate the value of different positive elements of our culture. This will require a bottom-up approach in the design and implementation. Within the Caribbean, what this can look like is a regional coordination with local implementation. One of the things that I believe that UNESCO must also be wary of, especially as they mentioned the role of role models, UNESCO must be wary of the growing movement of men's rights activism within the Caribbean, and that not everyone that is willing to work with men and boys is willing to work from a gender transformative approach or willing to work for gender equality. So it's really important that we outline that working with men and boys is not an end in itself, but just a means to get to gender equality.
Kevin, thank you very much. And you've brought in the issue of the backlash, which I think is really critically important as we think of this. Thank you. Ana Inês, could I have your final recommendations to UNESCO based on what you've heard?
Sí, brevemente pidiéndole disculpas. Sí, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, just very quickly. Can you hear me? The interpreter has a very difficult time hearing Ana Inês. I do apologize to the interpreters if I speak very quickly. I'll try to speak actually more briefly and more slowly. Okay, firstly, Tim, at the beginning, you were talking about a network of role models, let's say. Now, this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. We've got the United Nations, goodwill ambassadors, et cetera, et cetera. I think every time you do that, you need to roll out a lot of support, and there's got to be a lot of things that are done to enhance their visibility. And then you also have to try to think about what institutions have to be developed at a local level to make it possible for more people to have a life that's like, or at least be able to have a conduct that's similar to that of their role models. So you really have to think about local needs that have to be satisfied in order to make changes possible. I don't think that we can have a network of role models without a network of support, a big network of support later on. I think there also has to be a big transverse approach. There's no single one-size-fits-all approach. We have to bear in mind the specificity of all of the different cultures involved in order to find the right mechanisms to trigger these conversations that will lead to a cultural change. Some people are alone. Some people are from native or indigenous communities. And sort of there's a gulf between all of these different cultures, but people are all human, right? So we have to make sure that we cater to their cultural specificities as well. And now another thing that is important is language. Language is crucial if we want to change the narrative. In Spanish and in Portuguese, perhaps you can correct me if I make if I'm wrong, but language is one way of making gender specific. But there are ways of using language that shows that we're actually trying to induce through language a change in behavior. This has an impact on the way people think. So by reinventing the language, we can at least sow the seeds of a new reality in people's minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Inés. Thank you for everyone for bearing with us. We started slightly late, and I've got a great pleasure if people can stay with us for another 5 minutes. Great pleasure to introduce Paula Estoriz Cavero, who's the UNESCO representative from their office in Kingston, who would like to provide some closing remarks on behalf of UNESCO, and then I will end the session.
Hi, thank you, Tim. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Ha sido muy enriquecedor escuchar a los y las panelistas.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. Today we talked about many things, and there's still much to do to tackle gender equality in our region. In fact, it is one of the gender equality is one of the global priorities of UNESCO. And UNESCO is trying to develop inclusive policies with all stakeholders through consultations in all its spheres of competence, in which UNESCO tries to foster programs that incorporate a gender perspective. UNESCO is also for the elimination of all types of discrimination and violence against women and girls. The global pandemic has showed and increased the inequalities and many of the problems in our societies. That is why we need to keep our long-term vision while acting in the short term. We have seen that violence against women and girls has increased in Latin America during the pandemic, which is why UNESCO supports the inclusive participation of women in all decision making, including during this crisis, to guarantee that the concerns and aspirations and expectations of women in all spheres and with a cross-sectorial approach be taken into mind. This includes female essential workers, strengthening social networks for women in disadvantaged situation, and it includes the situation of women in informal employment and in the caregiving industry. The crisis has showed the importance of care and in our societies, but also the terrible situation of this sector in our societies. And usually it is women who give this care, whether paid or not. we must also bear in mind our youth, with more than 1.2 billion young people, because they have also been extremely affected by the pandemic, which has exacerbated inequalities in terms of income and also opportunities. UNESCO, with its work centered on youth issues, also wants to stress the impact of the pandemic on young women, including in terms of systemic violence, a lack of opportunities, and many gender gaps, including in access to education, access to employment, and political representation. The social and human sciences sector wishes to cast in a positive note our reflections on masculinity and gender and incorporate men and boys with women and girls in the global movement for gender equality. To conclude our consultations, I would like to recall that UNESCO always supports collaboration across countries, across the region, to foster the importance of gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. Well, what a fantastic conversation. I'd like us to give a round of applause to all the panelists. Thank you for a tremendous conversation. We could have talked and talked for several more hours. Really grateful to the organizers and to the translators and to all of you for your fantastic participation. Please keep in contact. We have 2 more regional consultations to go. We've got one on Thursday for Africa. We have one for the Arab region on Monday, and we'll take everything away from this conversation, your inputs, your questions, the really insightful contributions from our panelists, and we'll keep in touch with you to help shape this new and exciting program. I think just to close by saying, I think what I've really heard from all of us today is that we need systemic change, that we need to break several cycles, and that policies and laws are important but are not sufficient enough. And if there's anything that we need to address machismo. And so let's move together forwards with hope, with aspiration, and work on these really important issues in Latin America and the Caribbean collectively. So thank you all very much for participating. Thanks for staying with us, and thanks for a great conversation. And please stay tuned and stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you. We're looking forward to the report or the notes of this most interesting consultation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.